Hi, I'm Steve Caseley from CBT Nuggets, and this MicroNugget is focused on estimating games, or in other words, a really cool, fun way to do Scrum estimating and reach consensus group decision making. Consensus group decision making is too formal a word for Scrum Agile development, so we put a cool word on it and we call it estimating games. And although I'm sure there's as many estimating games or group decision-making processes in play around the world as there are organizations doing Scrum Agile development, generally speaking, we break our estimating games down into two different categories. We have group ranking, and group ranking is often by the textbook simply referred to as the estimating game, or we have this really interesting one that's called planning poker. But let's first have a see at what group ranking is all about. And the group ranking or the group estimating game starts with the entire team, definitely the entire development team, including the Scrum Master, but ideally with the product owner as well, gathered in a spot where they can have easy, open conversation, and gathered in a spot where there's a whiteboard, a cork board, or some other wall surface that we can use for our group ranking game. And then the game begins. The game begins by team member number 1 going out and selecting a story. So in this case, team number 1 went out and selected the story, randomly from our list of stories, simply said, this story looks like fun, takes it out, reads it out loud, reads the story description to the entire group, and says, in a general order of rank, I think it's just slightly in the top of the first quarter of ranking, where again, we're assuming we're ranking it from simple to complex. So that's team number 1's turn. Team member 2 then comes up, and team member 2 has the option of saying, I don't believe you positioned this correctly, or team number 2 has the option of selecting another story and ranking it. So now team member 2 said, this looks like a fun story, I want to read this one out loud, reads it out loud and says, I believe, and it's the team member's personal opinion. This is not into discussion. This is that team member's position says, this one is quite a bit more complex than the last story. I think it belongs down here almost at the bottom of the 3/4 level of complexity. So that team number 2's turn is done. Along comes team member number 3, and they again select a story. So they selected this story and said, I think this story is just a little less complex than the previous story. So team member number 3 ranks that particular story here. Team member 4 comes up, it's their turn. Team member 4 says, I don't really agree. You put that story here as slightly less complex than this story, but you know what? I really believe this story is just a little bit more complex than that story, so I'm going to move it, and I'm going to move it down there. And now that is team member 4's turn is done. They don't get to select a new story. If you challenge, your team is done and your story has been moved down there. So the next team member comes up, team member number 4, and they say, I'm relatively happy with what's going on so far, selected a new story. The stories are just selected at randoms when they want to play with, when they want to can think about, and pulled it out and said, I think it's a little bit simpler, and ranked it up there. Great, that team member's turn is done. The next team member comes up, has the option of selecting a story, or in this case said, no, I don't really agree with your ranking, and moved it down. Each team member in their turn has the option of challenging any story. It's not just the last story read, it's any story. So instead of saying it's the last story read, they could have alternatively said, now that I've heard that story, I don't think this one is as complex, and moved it up. By turn, each team member can challenge the position of any location in our rank or select a new story. And the group ranking game continues until all stories have been selected and ranked, and all team members agree on the ranking, and then you have the relative order of the stories, the relative degree of complexity to complete the stories. And my personal favorite estimating game is planning poker. And maybe that's just because I'm recording this MicroNugget while I'm in Vegas at a conference, but I find planning poker with poker on my brain from Vegas is one of the more fun ways to develop consensus for the estimation of my stories. Planning poker starts with my entire team around my poker table, or around the table, or standing in a room, but let's pretend we're in Vegas and we're around a nice green felt poker table. But instead of having a traditional card deck, the deck that I hand out to my team members is identical to each team member. So each team member gets the identical deck, and each team member gets a deck with a 1, a 2, a 3, a 5, an 8, and a 13 card in it. Yes, it's the Fibonacci sequence, and we're going to use this card deck to estimate each story. My poker game begins with selecting one story from my stories. We take it out, and one team member, and often it's the product owner, will read out the story so that everyone around the table has a firm understanding of what the story is all about. And then the poker game begins, and every team member reaches into their card deck and pulls out the card that they believe represents the order of complexity, the effort, the story points that's going to be required to complete the story. So these three team members all agreed that they think it's a 3. This team member ranked it as an 8, and this team member ranked it as a 1. So we don't have group consensus. Typically in planning poker, we give the team members that have the most disparate estimates a chance to defend, to support, to explain why this team member thought it was an 8, and this team member thought it was a 1. They do their explanation, and we say, it's time to vote again. This time, they put their cards down and they revote. This guy said, same estimate, I still think it's a 3. This guy said, same estimate, I think it's a 3. This guy, after listening to, or gal, after listening to the explanation from this gal's, says, yep, it's probably not as complex as I thought. I'm going to move this down and make it a 5. This person, again, listened to the other person's argument, says, yep, I understand why it's a little more complex, moved it up to a 3, and actually swayed this person's vote as well. So now we have 3 3s and 2 5s. Now we have the option of saying, are we close enough to agree, or do we need to go into another round of discussion? And in this case, they say, we're close enough to agree, and we're going to agree that the estimate for this story should be a 5 because we want to err on the side of high as opposed to erring on the side of low. And that completes our discussion on estimating games. I hope this has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.